Um, so tonight we're going to be in Mark chapter 6. We were actually talking about this with Gilbert and Sam before everyone else showed up. But the story that we're going to cover in Mark chapter 6 is found in all four Gospels. One of the few stories that's found in all four of them without fail. But generally, when we reference this story, we always talk about Peter walking on the water. Matthew is the only gospel that recounts Peter walking on water. All four of the gospels tell the story, but the other three don't say anything about Peter. So just be aware that it is the same story. We can often make the mistake of thinking that they're talking about different events, but they're very much the same story. So start out with, he went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown, and among his relatives, and in his own household." And he could do no mighty works there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching. So, to start with, Jesus goes back to his hometown where everybody knows him. And it says that the thing that astonished him was their complete disbelief in him. So it's so great that he heals some people, but he counts that as minor things. Right? He says he can do no great works. Why? Because pretty much everything else he's done is based or has foundation in the faith of the person receiving the miracle. And here you have people without faith. Now, I want to point out that this is not solely a prophet or Jesus situation. This happens to us all the time, right? I struggled coming back to Waterloo or Cedar Falls to preach because I came from here. And there is a lot of people that still remember me and remember what kind of life I live. And a great many of those people have reached out to me since I've moved back. And notice none of them are interested in coming here. Now, here's the thing. I'm not the only one out of that time of my life who turned our lives around. There's a great many of them that go to church now, go to church pretty regularly, pretty faithfully. But they don't want to come to church here because I'm here. And it's not that I wronged them in any particular way, but it's hard to hold somebody in esteem when you've seen them at their worst moments. It's kind of the idea behind my one of my family members growing up. He was a bit old-fashioned, I guess you would say, but he was adamant that a man should never cry in front of a woman. That if you were, as a man, if you were going to cry, you called your friends, you called your brothers, you called somebody, but you did not cry in front of women. Now, that sounds a little outlandish, I'm sure, to some of you, but his thought process is this: that a man's responsibility is to be a protector of everyone that he's around. It doesn't matter what man we're talking about, everyone in the room should be able to look at every man in the room and consider them a protector. And his view on it was, if women start seeing us crying, they're going to lose respect for us as protectors. Now, I don't necessarily agree with him, but I do think that his thought process, there's something to be said about it. That when you see somebody at their weakest moment or at their lowest moment, it can be difficult to summon the respect that we're supposed to have for them. And that's really what Jesus is dealing with here. Not that he has some shady past or anything, but these are people that knew him as a kid. Before the miracles, before all the wise teachings, back when he was just some kid running around with his siblings. And it's hard. You can imagine it would be difficult to look at that kid all grown up and think of him as some righteous holy man. Right? Because the general populace has not put together that this is the Son of God. But they all acknowledge that he's some kind of prophet. I think that the warning that Jesus is giving us here is twofold. Is one, that we need to be aware that people fall short in this manner. And we can't be surprised when people have a hard time treating us with the respect or the dignity that we believe we deserve, especially men as spiritual leaders. It can be extremely difficult to gain that respect from others. I look at my own home, and my wife generally defaults to pretty much my expertise when it comes to the Bible. I mean, it's not like she's sitting at home arguing with me over what certain scriptures mean. But she doesn't come to me nearly as quickly as many other people do. Why is that? Well, because as my wife, she's not overly interested in me preaching to her for 20 minutes on the exposition of a specific verse. Whereas other people, you're going to a preacher, that's kind of what you expect. So you see the difference is that she sees a side of me that most other people don't get to see. And as a result, it's difficult. It would be absurd almost for her to react to me the same way that I would expect other people to react to me. Is that making sense to everybody? Huh? Yeah. The other warning though is that, at least I think that the other warning Jesus is giving us is that if we are going to be around or try to minister to people who have seen less than perfection from us, we got to be prepared for this. And notice also that even though they didn't appreciate him, even though they didn't believe in him, even though they didn't respect him, he didn't just leave. Right? When they disrespected him, when they naysayed him and all of this, he didn't just leave. He stayed. He did the work he could. And then he went on his way. And we don't see any anger or hatred from him. In fact, the only emotion that the scriptures give us is that he was astonished or surprised. We'll continue on with verse 7 here. So after they leave this particular village, he's going to start sending people out. And I'm going to have some things to say about this next segment as well, because I think there's a certain part of here that we tend to misconstrue. But I will ask what you guys have been taught on it and what you guys understand about it before I go into what I think. Verse 7 starts, "And he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. And he said to them, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you, and they will not listen to you. When you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. So this passage where it talks about shaking off the dust from your feet, we tend to, I'm going to try to word this in the right way here. We tend to make that part of the passage about us and then insist that the rest of it is no longer applicable. Which is pretty bizarre to me that we would piecemeal a passage like this. But we'll say for argument's sake that this is something that's applicable to us. I want to hear what you guys have been taught or what you guys understand about the concept of shaking off the dust from your feet. Okay. Okay. Anything else?
I have heard people stating that they don't even want to take polluted dust or dirt with you. I've never bought into that, but I've heard that said. I've always thought this is just a symbolic gesture. I'm leaving this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
On.
Gilbert, what Ms. Levon said was that it's talking about whether they accept or reject what you have to say is up to them and not you. Did I say that about right? Okay. Does anyone else have anything to add?
If there's anything that applies to us, the next verse certainly does. They went out and preached the message of prayer.
I find sometimes there's, when I practice humility, I just keep my mouth shut, and it works better that way. Maybe I don't have the confidence to, or the expertise, like the competency in the word yet, but there's a slight bit of friction between my angle of how these two things fighting against each other. The competency of knowing that this is something that's in the Word and that you want to relate it to people, and then at the same time, I think because of my normal nature of just, kind of a little bit harsh delivery, that it's not very humble, and so I pause before I go forward and get myself in trouble.
Okay. So I think you guys are all pretty well on point, but I do want to address, Sam, what you said you had heard about this. As far as the polluted dust, I don't think that the shaking off of dust was anything more than the same as when I say I wash my hands of this. Basically, we do what we can, and if they reject us and what we bring to them, then their salvation or condemnation is no longer on us. We're not responsible for it in any way. Because you notice also that it's not intended to be an insult. That's why they do it after they leave. They're not shaking off their sandals in front of people. That would be an insult. But instead, they're waiting until they leave the place and then doing it. And I think it's more of a statement to themselves than it is to anything. I think God knows more than enough to not have to have somebody tell him that I'm not going to be held responsible for this, right? So it's more of a statement to themselves. And the idea here is, I think, don't let the failure stick with you. This is gonna happen. People are gonna reject you. They're gonna reject what you're telling them. They're gonna reject what you're offering them. They're gonna reject me. Don't let the failure stick with you. You shake it off. You move on like it never happened. The reason I stayed with this point is because try to make sure I give the right title for it. The Christian Advocate, is that right? Christian Chronicle Gospel Advocate. Had a passage on there. It's been probably 3 years now. And we covered it in one of our intro to missions classes. The teacher had brought it up and asked us to talk about it. And the author had used this and had basically argued that what he got from this is that he's not going to waste his time telling the gospel twice to somebody when there's people who had not heard it once. His idea is if you reject the gospel, I'm going to move on immediately. I think that there was some flaws in that particular author's reasoning. I don't know anyone that I've ever met that I know of that has accepted the gospel the very first time you ever told them about it. I mean, how many times have you simply had a 5-minute conversation where you told them that Jesus Christ died for their sins and the only way to be redeemed is to accept that sacrifice and to bury themselves in the waters of baptism, to raise themselves up and commit themselves to God? How many times after saying that have you had somebody say, oh yeah, let's go get baptized?
I didn't read the article, so I don't know what he was saying.
Yeah.
What the argument was. But the way I would read what he is saying is if they don't show interest. Not if they're not baptized, but if somebody shows interest, I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
As
Well,
soon as they stop showing interest,
this particular author was using it as an argument for why foreign missions were necessary and local missions were not. So his argument was that the gospel is so pervasive in our culture that there's no one can argue that they've never heard about Jesus Christ. Even people who've never been in a church know who Jesus Christ is and what he did, whether they believe in it or not. And so his argument is they've heard the gospel, so we shouldn't be doing missions here.
okay.
So that was the premise of his argument anyways. But the main point is that this is a statement of innocence in the matter. It is not a symbol of anger or resentment. Right? These disciples that are sent out, they're not called to hate or resent the people for rejecting them. They're just told to make sure that they understand that it's not their fault. I move on from this point in particular into John the Baptist, the story of him dying. We're probably not going to get to. We might get to the 5,000. So King Herod heard about basically the casting out of demons. Okay. So verse 14 reads, King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some said John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. So what Herod is actually hearing is the healing and the casting out of demons. And so this all gets back to the king, to King Herod, and this is cause for alarm because the last person they've seen doing anything somewhat similar would be John the Baptist, or at least heard the teachings of John the Baptist, right? There's a lot of similarities, which there's going to be. They're cousins, right? So you can imagine that this is going to cause some issues for Herod. And verse 15 says, "But others said he is Elijah, and others said he's a prophet like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, 'John, whom I beheaded, has been raised.' For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her." Now, verse 18 says, "For John had been saying to Herod, 'It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife.' And Herodias had grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly." So, I think John the Baptist, to me, his entire life's message is summed up in his death, right? So he has, basically, we have two segments of John the Baptist's life that we're privy to. We have before Jesus, right, when he's out teaching people and calling them to repent and all of that, and then we have this story. Like, everything in between is pretty much an account of Jesus' ministry. And I think that this is included not because his death has an important message for us. You see, we're talking about somebody, and regardless of what it says about fear, at the end of the day, King Herod had every single authority and power to kill somebody on a whim. As long as they weren't Roman, he could kill anyone he chose. John the Baptist was bold enough to go in and tell him that he was sinning against God for marrying his brother's wife. Here's the thing. People don't get private audiences with kings. Okay? Generally speaking, if you're approaching royalty, at least in Roman society, you do not get private audiences. The most privacy you can hope for is him, his advisors, and his guards. That's as private as it gets, speaking to royalty or leadership within the Roman Empire. So, John is going to go confront this man and tell him he's wrong and call him out in a very personal way in front of his subjects. I think that there's an argument here that takes a lot of courage. That is very bold. And what I mean to say about John's death and the message that it has for us is that we have to be willing to be equally bold. There's so often where we're afraid to call out sin in people's lives because it's hard, or because we're worried about the relationship that we might have with them, or the consequences it might have on our lives. And before anyone even comes up with the argument, I'm going to address it. I get it. I may not have personal experience, but I get it. It's hard, especially when it's family. Okay? Especially when it's family. But there is a reason why we are told that we might have to put it away. That everything in the New Testament tells us that we're supposed to call out sin and flee from sin. Now, there's a big difference between fleeing from sin and fleeing from a sinner, right? Because you've heard me make what might appear to be an opposing argument, and that we're not supposed to disfellowship somebody just because they're not believers in Christ. But here's the thing. Many of us have experienced all kinds of sin, whether it be homosexuality, self-mutilation, abortion, any kind of number of things that are societal issues that we are aware are against God's plan for us, that we would call sin. And I think that it's telling that so many of us are wholly opposed to it, except for when it's close to home. And I'm telling you this, I'm trying to be as gentle as I can because I'm aware of how personal of an issue I'm addressing right now. And I'm also aware of how difficult a thing that is to tell somebody and be willing to risk a relationship with that person in order to inform them of the nature of their sin. That's hard. But when we don't call out sin, we get situations in, I believe it was Nevada. There is a church in Nevada. I was reading a story about this certain preacher. And the story is that the preacher has been divorced, it was 6 times, and that he was currently remarried. Now, he addressed his congregation and informed them that he was getting a divorce and getting remarried for the 6th time to his secretary. He also informed them that he would still be preaching there, and so it wasn't a big deal. It got to this point because 5 times this man, he preached at the same congregation through all 5 of those divorces. 5 times this man divorced his wife, and the people of the congregation said nothing because he was the preacher. Now, you have somebody who has chosen a lifestyle of sin. I don't think you can argue that he sinned once at this point. He's established a pattern of lifestyle. And he's in charge of instructing a congregation of believers. And this happens when good Christians are too afraid to call out sin when they see it. Is everyone on board with me? Okay. I'm trying really hard to say what I'm saying as nice as possible. But if you have any issues with this, if you believe that I'm wrong about my assessment, then say something now because this is a Bible study. But if you just have a personally hard time with it, I am free to talk to you about it. Okay. Like I said, I know how hard it is to be willing to sit in front of somebody and tell them that what they're doing is wrong. Especially when you know that there's a good chance that it means there are serious consequences. But I don't think that anything in the gospel, but especially when we look at John the Baptist and what he was willing to die for, I don't think we're given any other options. So, John the Baptist goes into King Herod's palace. He informs King Herod, you're doing wrong by marrying your brother's wife. That's not lawful. And so King Herod, because this is a holy man, and that's an interesting note that we're going to talk about here for a second too, is too afraid to kill him. So he actually just throws him in prison. King Herod was not known for his religious piety or his courage. And I think that this follows throughout society, and I think it has something to do with our collective consciences knows there's something true about all of this. I believe that. I believe that people who do not accept the gospel inherently know there's something real about it. And I say that because, I believe I brought this up last week, because of the people who talk to me differently when they find out what I do for a living. Suddenly, the most gruff, brash people you've ever met will clean up their language and talk a little bit different once they find out you're a preacher. Not only that, but they'll profusely apologize for cursing in front of you. But bother me. I mean, what comes out of your mouth is that's defiling you, not me. So, but I at least appreciate that there's certain respect there. But here's the thing: these are people who don't believe God is even real. So why would there be respect for somebody who preaches about something that's not real? I give you a side note about that little question. When I was younger, and by younger I mean like 5-6 years ago, I think, there's this made up story on the internet, and it's called, and it turned into like, it started out as a story, it turned into a fake religion, right? It's all meant to be a joke or a prank. It's not actually a religion. In fact, somebody registered it as a religion for tax breaks, but that's about it. It's called Pastafarianism. Pastafarianism. And they supposedly worship the flying spaghetti monster. This sounds childish, doesn't it? Now, if I were somebody that came to you and started preaching about the flying spaghetti monster, or I told you that that's who I worship, right? And you found out that I was a preacher in this congregation of Pastafarianisms, would you respect me? Would you clean up your act around me? Would you talk differently to me? And yet, here's the thing. Most of society argue that Christianity is just as absurd. But they treat you different. And invariably, almost everybody I talk to, right, as soon as they find out I'm a preacher, I get this line. I need to be going to church, I just haven't been able to make it lately, How long is lately? Well, 7, 8, 10, 15, 20 years, Well, here's the thing. Why even tell me that? If this isn't important to you, why bother making excuses for yourself? I think that subconsciously, most people recognize truth when they hear it, even if they're unwilling to accept it. Go ahead, Dave.
I've always considered in my mind that if we're made in the image of God, that understanding is there inherently.
Mm-hmm.
We know what's right and wrong inherently, and you can see that in societies. You go throughout civilization, even if there is no worship of God, murder is still wrong, lying is still wrong, stealing is still wrong.
Yeah, moral objectivity. That's what we call that.
I think that if we're made in the image of God, there's inherently.
Is it Romans 8 that talks about?
Romans chapter 1 talks about.
Is it 1 verse 8? Yeah. Yeah.
Even though we chose to consider, I will.
Well, you at least knew where I was trying to go with that. 1:18, yeah.
Even though they knew it was a lie, for they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped the truth of the That's the
Yeah, that is applicable, but that's actually not where I was headed. I'm pretty sure it's chapter 8. Where it talks about witnessing God in nature. Is it? Why did I not recognize that verse? Yeah. Yeah. 19. 19 and 20 is what I was thinking of. You're all right. You were spot on. I just didn't recognize the verse you read as the one I was trying to go for. Yeah, I think that verse tells us exactly what you said. That by our very nature and the nature of creation around us, we're going to come to inherent truths about God, whether we, like I said, whether we accept it or not, doesn't change the fact that we recognize it as true. Right? So, my point in all of this is that Herod is not unique in any way. Right? His response to a holy man, it's not really unheard of, even in today's culture and society. I've got a lot of people that say some really nasty things about me just because I'm a preacher. Right? In fact, some of them I've known very recently, and then quite a few that I've known quite a while in my past. They find out I'm a preacher, and suddenly I'm just the most wretched human being alive because, I don't know, you name it. There's all kinds of reasons why I'm terrible for doing this. But they'll never say it to me. I've noticed that over the last, I would say, probably 2 years. I've never had somebody come up to my face and tell me why I'm a bad person for being a preacher. Now, I see videos that they post online about what a terrible person I am, or comments that they'll make on social media, but it's always to somebody else, and it's very clearly their intention that I never see those things. So I don't think Herod is wholly unique. I think people are always going to say or do horrible things or wish ill on people who speak truth into their lives. But we must be bold. We have to be willing to speak that truth. And generally speaking, you're going to find that most of the time they recognize enough truth about what we're talking about that they're going to fear the wrath of God. And that's really what it boils down to. That's why Christians don't get attacked nearly as much as you would think they would. Or at least not nearly as much as they did during the Roman times. Because people inherently understand that there's something real about what we're saying. And if God is real, He's probably not somebody you're going to want to make mad. So hopefully that's a warning, but also hopefully it's an encouragement to you guys. It's the worst thing that's going to happen. And I told Dave that's one point that was why I appeared so fearless so many times in my life. Is just I always ask myself, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Because chances are it's not nearly as bad as I would let myself believe. Or better than somebody else going to hell. And if they do reject you and cut off ties, that's when the brushing the dust off your feet comes in. Because ultimately there's nothing more you can do. So we'll move on from this point. We'll get into the actual story of his death. Verse 21. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom." And she went out and said to her mother, "For what should I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oath and his guest, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and laid it in the tomb. This should tell you how self-destructive unrighteous wrath is. That how self-destructive grudges can be. This girl was just told that she could receive up to half of a kingdom. I don't know if that even computes in everyone's mind on just what Herod has offered this girl. But half a kingdom is a lot. And her mother would have only benefited from that. But her mother is so angry and holds such a grudge that she gave up all of that just for the sake of this guy being executed. A guy who was already in prison. He was never getting out. Herod had no plans to release him. But she was so angry and so indignant about being told the truth that she would rather have him executed than receive half of an entire kingdom. And I think that if we're being honest with ourselves, generally speaking, when we start holding grudges, we kind of may not be quite so extreme of an example, but we often find that it's just as self-destructive. It gets in the way of things. It blinds us to what the best potential option is. And we start seeking vengeance for the sake of vengeance, even when it doesn't make sense to pursue it any longer. Personal opinion, I think that's why God tells us to not pursue it. I think that's why he tells us to just trust that he's going to take care of it. The next verse goes into the story of the feeding of 5,000. And I think that there's, we're not going to gloss over the fact that this is a tremendous miracle that Jesus provides. But I think that there's some points outside of it just being a miracle that we need to take notice of. So in verse 30, this is after they came and buried John the Baptist. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. So I want to first point out in verse 31, right? So these guys come back to Jesus. They tell him all the things that they've done. They just buried John the Baptist. They've been casting out demons. They've been healing people. They've been preaching the great news. They've been preaching repentance. All the stuff that they're supposed to do. And Jesus tells them, okay, go over here away from people and rest for a while. It is perfectly acceptable for you to understand that you are a human being and your physical body and your less than perfect spirit has limitations. And sometimes you got to stop and take care of that. But if your rest has been 3 times longer than your work was, I would suggest that you're probably not resting anymore. Right? So, by all means, sometimes you're going to have to set aside time and rejuvenate yourself. The elders provided me with a similar opportunity. That's what the trip to Georgia was supposed to be for. That was a time for me to step away from the work for a little bit and take some time to recharge myself, to to make sure that I was resting from the work I was doing with the expectation that I came back and got back to work. Right? I'm sure they wouldn't be too thrilled if they found out that after I got back, I just didn't pick up any of the tasks that I was doing before I left. And I think that that's the idea that Jesus is giving these men. It's saying that they're so busy they didn't even get to eat. And Jesus doesn't perform a miracle so that they don't have to eat, although I'm sure he could have. He doesn't demand that they figure it out. He doesn't demand that they push through. He doesn't berate them for needing to eat. He doesn't tell them, well, man should not live on bread alone, right? That would be an easy response. He just tells them to go and rest. So we continue on in this story, right? And he looks out at this massive crowd of people, and it says that he has compassion on them because they are like sheep without a shepherd. Now, just before we even get into his response to all of this, the implication is that sheep need shepherds. Do you guys understand that it's saying that? That Jesus Christ had compassion because they needed shepherds. It is so easy, and this brings me back to our original point tonight. It's so easy to look at the elders, which we call shepherds, right? We say that that's really what their job is. It is so easy to look at them as men. It's so easy for us to just look at them as another common imperfect man, and so we get to assess with our judgment whether they're righteous or not, or whether they're right in any given circumstance or not. It would be so easy to say that I know better. But they're shepherds, and I'm a sheep. And it doesn't matter how smart of a sheep I am, I'm still a sheep. And it doesn't matter if I think that the shepherd in question is a fool and that he's leading us all to our demise, I'm a sheep. I mentioned this on Sunday. I actually called Keith, how you missed it, Dave. And I pointed out that I'm not always in agreement with our elders here. There's a lot of things that I would say differently, or I would do differently, or I would handle differently. But at the end of the day, when they tell me we're going to do it this way, I need to know my place. I speak my opinions on it, try to give what insight I may have. But at the end of the day, they have to know, they have to be able to trust that when they say we're going to do this, that I'm going to go along with that. I'm not going to give them trouble. I'm not going to stand in their way. I'm not going to tell them they're wrong. I'm not going to berate them. I'm not going to ignore them. I'm going to submit. Sheep need shepherds. But a shepherd is no good when the sheep don't follow. So we'll move into this story. Well, I know we're running short on time. In fact, I would argue that the kids are up here, so we'll wrap it up pretty quick. So getting into this story, let's see, 35. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." Sounds reasonable enough, right? And he said to them, but he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So he sat down in groups by hundreds and by fifties, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to the heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them. And they all ate and were satisfied, and when they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Now we're gonna finish talking about this passage, and we're gonna end it there for tonight. But one point that I did not actually ever pick up on until this week when I started going through studying chapter 6. Who was originally supposed to feed them?
Originally,
Who was told to feed them?
well, the disciples were told them.
And who fed them? Jesus actually instructs the disciples, you go and give them something to eat. He doesn't tell them how. He doesn't tell them what they're supposed to feed him. He just says, you go feed them. Jesus has already given them power to do miracles. You think about this, casting out demons, healing diseases, right? Should be small fries to feed a couple thousand people. And yet they're completely clueless. Now understand, they don't even make the argument, we don't have the power to do that. We're not able to do that. They're flabbergasted. It's not even occurring to them that Jesus has already given them what they need to do this. But Jesus commands it. And I think that the reason he doesn't give them specific instructions is because he's desiring for them to grow. You know, I know when I was little, we had 2 really different ways of talking to kids, at least that I experienced. And you had parents that would treat you like a kid, and they would treat you like you were always going to be a kid. And then you had people who treated you like an adult, but only allowed you the responsibility of a child. So, my grandfather and his son, the guy commonly referred to as uncle, they fell into that latter category, right? And so that was always what was expected out of me. Go and do this. Well, how do I do that? Figure it out. And it wasn't usually until I started screaming because I hurt myself or something similar that they actually came out and helped me. And it would be easy for me to just be angry. Why didn't you just come show me how to do this? But there was a valuable lesson there. There is value in figuring things out. But there's also value in just growing. And I think that Jesus, all he's doing here is he's pushing them to grow in another way. But I do want to make the point that in Jesus' eyes, feeding these people was just as spiritually important as casting out demons or healing the sick were. Most people came to Jesus for food or healing. Now, they got teachings, but most people came for a miracle. How much easier would it have been on him to just say, that's not what I'm here for, you go away, and only accept the people who came to listen to him because that's what he was there to do? Sometimes spiritual tasks, helping people, taking care of people, it can be tiring. Yeah, I'm sure Dan has noticed better than anyone just how much benevolence that I go through. But I go out and I see people who are in need. And here's the thing, I'm nobody's fool, okay? I know that a lot of people who come in and ask for our help, I know the majority of them aren't interested. I know that the vast majority of them will never shadow the steps of this church again, until they need something else. I'm aware that most people are just looking for help. But why is it wrong to help them? Is it my primary purpose? No. But you know what? If somebody is hungry, you feed them. We make it so complicated. We really do. We come up with all kinds of rules and stipulations and, how much are we supposed to do this or how often. Or if somebody's hungry, you feed them. And maybe it's easy for me because I've actually seen somebody starving. I don't know how many of you have ever witnessed that. But I can assure you that if you have, you would not ever have an issue giving somebody food again. It is the most unpleasant experience. And yet so often Christians can be so hard-hearted towards this. And it's really something to brag about, and I often do, about Cedar Lou and the elders we have here and the leadership and the members, because we really do better than most churches I've been in contact with when it comes to benevolence. We help a lot of people. But I caution you not to let yourselves grow cold to it. Don't let yourself get hard-hearted. Are they supposed to take care of themselves? Absolutely. It's not even an argument. Would it be better for them to go out and work for what they have? Absolutely. But for whatever reason, they're hungry. These people, they come and sure, they hear Jesus speaking, but the vast majority of them came for a miracle. But now they're hungry. And Jesus tells them, go feed them. It's not complicated. There's not some theological issue that has to be addressed here. They're hungry. Go feed them. I hope that you'll keep it in mind, that you'll consider it as you're talking to people, as you're coming across these opportunities, because that's how we're supposed to see it. It's an opportunity. You see a homeless guy, take him out to eat. And then ask him why he's homeless. Ask him what got him there. Ask him for his story. Get to know him. Then tell him yours. Don't you know that that's what the good news sounds like? The good news isn't just me saying Jesus came and died for your sins. The good news is, I was this man, and now I'm this man. The good news is that he can do that for you too. That's what evangelism looks like. But they're not going to be interested in your story if you don't ask about theirs. And if you're not interested in hearing their story, you've already lost. You've already failed. Some things to hopefully consider as we continue in our week. Does anyone have any last points they want to make before we close up with prayer? Okay, let's go to the throne. Dear Heavenly Father, we